This session is called International Ethics. I believe it's very important because there are a lot of events in the world today that people don't really understand. And in fact, many times they are misled on purpose or by accident by people who really don't know what they're talking about. So, what I want to try to do is provide a frame of reference, a frame of right reference, to understand what is going on in the world and to help everyone understand what they know and what they need to know in order to properly assess dynamics and events that go on in the world. Now, unfortunately, I'm going to use words that have been weaponized. And one word that's been weaponized is rules, okay? Um, we've heard the rules based order is bad. Well, okay, this is disinformation. This is meant to get people thinking a certain way. The reality is you need rules for everything. You can't play a football game if you don't have rules. Okay, that doesn't mean that a football game is somehow evil because it has rules. There is an international order, and there are international laws or rules by which this order functions and is supposed to function. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Okay, so again, I want people to have the right frame of reference and understand important concepts because a lot of chatters don't know what they're talking about or purposely misleading people. Okay, so there are codes of conduct and there are structures in the world. And the primary actors on the international stage are states or countries. Now, there are non state actors, and these are like international institutions, multinational corporations, individuals, non governmental organizations, various associations of one type or another, acting for one cause or another. And increasingly, modern international law has dealt with these entities and assigned to them certain rights, duties, and more. So let's talk now about James Brown Scott. James Brown Scott was an American lawyer. He was a whale, as they say, in the profession. He born in 1866, died in 1943. And he was an advisor of presidents. He went to The Hague, I believe, both times in 1899 and 1907. He was an advisor to a number of international legal organizations. He wrote a number of articles, books, and other tracts to advance international law. And in 1934, he wrote and published a book called Catholic Conception of International Law. And he basically said that international law should be Catholic as the Catholics started it. Well, today, jurists, lawyers understand that. They accept that. It wasn't always that way. The view for a very long time was that Hugo Grotius, who lived from 1583 to 1645, was the founder of international law. He was a Dutchman, and he wrote a book about a treatise on war and peace in 1625 that was very important in reaching the peace or the Treaty of Westphalia. He also wrote a book in 1605 on the law of the seas, which remains the correct articulation of international law, maritime law to this day, which is that the seas are free. You have freedom of navigation, and that is being hindered in some parts of the world today, as I previously spoke to you about. So he wrote these ideas. A lot of people, he wrote these books. A lot of people think that he is the founder of international law, but that's not true. You had James Brown Scott, this huge American lawyer, I believe he was Presbyterian, came in and said, no, the Catholics did it. So the big Catholic players in this regard were Francisco Victoria, who is considered one of the founders of the Salamanca School. He lived in the early 1500s. The other one was Francisco Suarez, a Jesuit, who lived in the late 1500s, early 1600s. And then of course, we mentioned Hugo Grotius. So you got to know these names. So let's go to James Brown Scott. So he wrote that, quote, the modern law of nations, of which Victoria was the expounder, Suarez the philosopher, and Hugo Grotius the systematizer, is the contribution of what we may call, and indeed must call, the Spanish school of international law. For if Grotius was not a Spaniard by blood, he was a Spaniard in his conception of international law, so far as the basic principles of his system are concerned. End of quote. So this is very important. This is a very important quote, very important finding by James Brown Scott, and it had huge ramifications. Later on, Scott wrote to the Father General of the Jesuits in a letter dated September 29, 1934, which I looked at in the archives at Georgetown University. And Scott told the Father General that he gave a copy of his book to Monsignor Pizzardo, two copies of the book to Monsignor Pizzardo, with one copy to go to Pope Pius XI, who was the Pope at the time. Scott then told the Father General that his book, The Catholic Conception of International Law, was meant to show, quote, that the Catholic conception of international law should be, and therefore must be, the accepted law of nations, of the future, if not of the present, if the intercourse of nations is to be, as it must, be both moral and Christian, end of quote. That's very profound. James Brown Scott, an American Presbyterian, wrote to the Father General of the Jesuits, quote, the Catholic conception of international law should be, and therefore must be, the accepted law of nations, of the future, if not of the present, if the intercourse of nations is to be, as it must be, both moral and Christian, end of quote. And indeed, as time has gone on, the Catholic conception of the law of nations, a number of the principles in there, number of the ideas in there, have actually been absorbed, taken, adopted, acted upon by the international order, meaning international organizations, meaning international law rules. So let's break this down. Okay, so the term law of nations is a very broad term. It includes more than just simply statutes or rules. Okay, it involves an underlying philosophy or theology. Okay, when you come to the Catholic law of nations, you have revelation and you have the natural law, forming the basis of the Catholic law of nations. These are what you might call very first principles, the first principles. Now, the Catholic law of nations is different from what I call the Grotian, named after Hugo Grotius, or the secular law of nations. Hugo Grotius, or Grotius as we call him for short, in his law of nations, from which came Wolff and Pufendorf and Vattel and Kent and other jurists, in his law of nations, he starts with the natural law, with his conception of the natural law. He references scripture, but he also starts primarily and mainly with his idea of natural law. Okay, and with his understanding of it. So, you have the very first principles in this philosophy, and there are other systems of natural law. I'm sure that there are Far Eastern systems, other systems of the law of nations. I'm sure there are Far Eastern systems, there may be African systems on this, Middle Eastern, Islamic systems of law of nations, and their foundational first principles may not be the natural law, or may not be all the natural law, may not be Catholic theology, but it's some other philosophy. Okay, so there's some other underlying philosophy of first principles. So we have the first principles. Okay, so this is going to be theology or philosophy, natural law, revelation. And from those first principles are derived other first principles or other principles upon which the state actors act. From these principles, then, comes custom. Custom is further defined, explained, clarified, codified in what are known as treaties or agreements, or what sometimes is called positive law, international positive law. In addition to this, okay, these treaties or agreements, there is something called municipal law or domestic laws, like the U.S. Code, like the Indiana statutes, stuff like that, like the common law. Okay, and then there's something called private international law, which is a set of rules, set of laws, agreements, conventions that govern commercial transactions, business transactions, and personal transactions to an extent. All these things I've talked to you about is within this concept of the law of nations. Okay? All right. Now, I've told you that there's two basic views of the law of nations. One of them I call the Grotian, after Hugo Grotius. I think it's more secularized. He wrote his tracts on the law of the sea and on war and peace. And then you had people after him, like I said, Wolf, Pufendorf, Vattel, very important with the American founders. Kent, who was a great American jurist, and others. And then you have the Catholic view of the law of nations, which is what Scott is talking about. And the Catholic view of law of nations comes from St. Thomas Aquinas with his Aristotelian philosophy and logic, and also he goes to the School of Salamanca, which looked at this Thomistic view of existence, which also included the fathers of the church and Revelation. And then it goes to Suarez, and then it goes to Taparelli, who wrote a lot about the natural law in the mid 1840s. Epstein, who wrote his books that I've talked to you a lot about. And here we are today. So, the Catholic view of the law of nations is, in my estimation, both more correct and more complete. Okay, what do I mean by that? Is more correct, and I guess both these concepts are somewhat interchangeable. But it's both correct because it looks at both revelation and reason. It examines the purpose of the person, the family, the ethnic group, the society, the state, and the international community. It's more complete in that it sees all these entities, the individual or person. It sees the family, sees the ethnic group, which is extended family. It sees the country, the state. It sees the international community. Okay, so it sees these entities. It sees relationships between these entities and the right relationships. It recognizes an international community as opposed to an anarchic state of community. You've heard that term from Mearsheimer and other people. We live in an anarchic world. Not really. I mean, the Grotian system would be more supportive of this idea of an anarchic world. But the Catholic view of the law of nations says no. We live in an international community. There's a community of nations, and I submit to you that the United Nations is a, albeit imperfect, realization of this Catholic idea of a community of nations or community of states. And so you're seeing, albeit imperfectly, the implementation of the Catholic law of nations. And then finally, I think a big area that the Catholic law of nations is more complete is that it necessarily allows intervention. An intervention, as I've explained elsewhere, includes a number of things. It can mean sanctions, embargo. It can mean stepping into a country to stop the suppression of a people by a tyrant, changing conditions in a country that's disordering the world. Justice and charity in the Catholic view are supposed to inform the actions of states and the actions of everyone for that matter. And what you also see in the Grotian view, there are also these ideas of justice and charity motivating international actors. Okay, so let's talk about John Epstein, and his book that he edited, The Code of International Ethics. It's a good set of succinct, comprehensive rules or ethics. It was written under the guidance of the Malines or Michelin group, what I call them, or Congress, as some people call them, compiled by the International Union of Social Studies. These are really smart people in social studies, international law. They were experts. I believe some were Catholic, some weren't, but they wrote a number of these codes of ethics in a lot of different fields. They stopped writing in 1969 for a number of reasons. They died out. The Nouvelle Theologie started to take over. So the formulation that the Malines group did, which was more Thomistic, went out of favor. But we saw recently with Pope Francis in March of this year that he's calling people back to this Thomistic look at the world, which implicates the Catholic law of nations. Okay, so um, Epstein's Code of International Ethics uh, is based on principles from the Law of Nations, the book he wrote, and from the Catholic view of the Law of Nations, the natural law, custom, positive law, and municipal law. Okay, positive law again means treaties, statutes, stuff like that. Okay, the origination, of course, we talked about St. Thomas Aquinas through School of Salamanca, Suarez, Taparelli, and on down. We've talked about the differences, and this code of ethics deals with big principles that are flushed out more elsewhere. But the principles in the code of ethics you can find in the current international system of laws and organizations, norms of conduct, treaties, and more on, and more. Okay, so post World War II, um, there was developed an international order, and I've been alluding to this. And a lot of these concepts, like I said, that were in Epstein's book, showed up in the United Nations and the international order that developed. Um, Antonio Cassese is deceased now. He wrote a book, 2005, called International Law. It's a major textbook. He writes that Hitler's invasion of Poland in September 1939 prompted U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull to determine that, quote, we must begin almost immediately to plan the creation of a new system, end quote. The British and the Americans did most of the work in setting up the UN, but their meetings were with the leadership of the Soviet Union and China between about October 1943 and February 1945. Now, the Americans wanted to ban resort to military force in international relations, removal of traditional concepts of international relations that consisted of spheres of influence, balances of power. We're seeing all that come back, right? And unilateral action. Okay. The most powerful allies, which would be Russia, China, UK, and the United States, and then later France, fighting the Axis powers, would be given a very powerful and preeminent role in keeping the peace under this new world order. So the result was a political entity, quote, that pursued political objectives, albeit within a legal framework, end of quote, with the great powers, quote, safeguarding peace and security on behalf and in the interest of all nations of the world, end of quote. And the great powers best safeguarded or supervised this peace with the UN Security Council. And that's a totally separate discussion of the weaknesses and the strengths of the UN Security Council. But the idea was that the great powers were going to work for peace, work together for peace, because they just got done fighting a war. Okay, so the United Nations Charter sets out really three major purposes. And the UN Charter is what was developed by all these negotiations between the great powers. And that is to keep the peace, um, to stop breaches of the peace, to promote social and economic development, and to promote human rights. Those are the three big areas that this new world order that the UN Charter was going to get into and to promote. And when we're talking about human rights, we're talking about fundamental human rights. We're talking about like the right to a family, the right to work, the right to a culture, the right to belong to a nation, right to health care. I mean, this is the basic stuff. Okay, these are fundamental rights that the Catholic Church recognizes too. And then also fundamental right to freedom, religion, speech, and things like that. Okay. And someone else said the essence of the New World Order, and I think this is a bit simplistic, but it sums up in many ways, is you have the rule of law, you have freedom of navigation, you have human rights, and you have the sovereignty of nations. Those are important concepts, but it's not all of it. But these are important concepts that we're seeing nowadays. So we are seeing in the UN Charter rules and structure for a community of nations that is Grotian, but it also has large measure to Catholic law of nations in it. But at the root of this world order is law, and law means reason. It means the control of appetites and desires. It's clarity in norms of conduct. It is right order and peace, and it's unity. That's what you have with this new world order, with the United Nations and all that came from it. And we've been enjoying that for, what, 77 plus years. Okay. Um, so, talk about Epstein's book, Code of International Ethics. Um, and I'm just going to talk about the major parts because there are a lot of rules in it. So he says, first of all, he starts out with general discussion of natural law, and he discusses current international law and the current situation, which at the time in 52, 53, you had the rise of Soviet communism, which was a very threat to many societies. But you also he also discussed the UN and how it was there to keep peace. Then Epstein talks about human societies, the family, the city, the state, collaboration between states, and that there's a natural society of states. This is the Catholic view of the law of nations. There's a natural society. We're not an anarchic group of 193, little bouncing balls. We're actually part of a community because each state is not perfect. It's perfect in the sense it controls the laws and the people within its boundaries, but it needs the other states, it needs the other countries to function, to do that purpose. Okay, so then after a general discussion of human societies, there's a discussion of rights and duties of states, and these are fundamental rights and duties, and these are this broad brush, a lot of subparts of this which I can't get into, but I will over time. Um, so the rights of states are to existence, to self-preservation and defense, to independence, to sovereignty, which is territorial, personal, immigration, equality with other states, and to promote national interests. Duties are duties of justice and charity. Again, we're talking about the Catholic law of nations, with the natural law, with divine revelation. But a lot of these concepts are also found too in the Grotian law of nations. Okay, so next thing he looks at is rights and duties from positive international law or treaties. Treaties carry a moral obligation. If you don't keep treaties, it's a grievous sin. Okay, the next thing he talks about is relations between unequally developed societies. So he gets into the discussion of colonies, colonization, trusteeship in the United Nations. Next big topic is peace and war. Talks about international order and disorder and the purposes of war to bring international order back in line. In other words, one of the purposes of war is to stop disorder and to allow order to exist. Okay, the requirement, the need for peaceful solution of international conflicts. And then a more detailed discussion of war he goes into, its nature and lawfulness, as I mentioned. There's just war. There has to be legitimate authority, has to be just cause, It has to be grave and proportionate, use of force, reasonable hope of success, concern for the international common good, because there is an international common good, and sometimes war has to be waged to stop the aggressor so international common good can maintain, or war has to be fought to improve the international common good. And then, of course, right intention. He also talks about how to conduct hostilities, how to reestablish the peace, and then the ideas of intervention and neutrality. And intervention is a term that means that can include also war, but also can include, like I said, sanctions and helping an oppressed people, diplomatic initiatives, economic initiatives, all that. Okay, then also what Epstein does, he talks about international society, which is organized in accordance with the Christian order, organized with the natural law. And he talks about international morality, in which he talks about nationalism, internationalism, and supranationalism. If you have supranationalism, it's immoral. If you put your own people, your own country ahead of everyone else, it's immoral. And we see that in the world today. We've seen it in the past. And that kind of ideology, that kind of philosophy leads to disorder in the world, leads to wars, it leads to problems. And so then wars have got to be fought, unfortunately, to make it right order, to push that supranationalism back where it is and get the bad actors out of positions of authority and power. Okay, so that's his book in a nutshell. Major ideas which track with Catholic natural law, Catholic law of nations, Catholic revelation, insofar as that is used with law of nations. And so these are going to be concepts that we're going to keep coming back to. I've spoken and written a lot about it already, but I'm trying to give you an overview. So there are some principles that I think we have talked about in the Catholic law of nations and in international ethics. And I'm just repeating myself probably: no supranationalism, rule of law, sovereignty of countries, freedom of the seas, peace based on right order. You have to keep your treaties, protect the fundamental rights of individuals. There's an international community, an international common good, and that has to be defended. And the United Nations, in large measure, is built to do that. And U.S. foreign policy, in large measure, has done that too, to build the international common good, to build this international community. And then there's this idea of intervention, which has a number of connotations, to include going to war with another country or saving an oppressed people from their tyrants. So that's the talk for today. I hope this has been helpful. Thank you.